Hi, everyone.
We know y'all want a cocktail, but just bear with us.
You have to bear with us before you get to the cocktail. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Armstrong. I'm a professor here at the Berkeley Journalism School. Wow, thank you. And I think you know our guests. Their bios are in the program. It's Nikole Hannah-Smith and Kevin Merida, and we're going to be
Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Nikole Hannah-Jones Smith. Oh my God. Nikole Hannah-Jones. and Kevin
Maybe
Merida.
we do need my bio.
Sorry. And we're going to be talking about impact. I don't know where that came from. So typically, impact is measured in terms of change. So the change that your journalism has had, whether good or bad. And it's basically the point of investigative journalism. So you do the reporting, and you want to have some sort of an effect. So what we're going to talk about today is, one, how you define impact. So what exactly is impact and how do we measure it? How do we look at impact in terms of how it affects communities, and how does impact affect journalists? I think historically, impact has been measured in some pretty typical ways in terms of, one, was there a law change? So was there some sort of legal difference in the work that you did? The second is if you look at prizes. So have you won a Pulitzer or a Polk Award or one of those things? And then the other is the metric by which sort of how many people have looked at your story, how many people are talking about it, what sort of impact has it had in the community. And so I'd like to start by asking both of you, how do you define impact, both in terms of like, start with Nikole, both in terms of what it is and how it's measured, or how you think it should be measured. I guess we'll start with Nikole, since Kevin pointed at you.
Okay. Good afternoon. So one, happy to be back at Logan. It's been a few years since I've been here. So always glad to be back and in a room full of investigative reporters. I'm going to ask you just a clarifying question. When you say impact, do you mean of my own work or in general?
Let's start with, I'm going to start with in general, and then I'm going to ask you in terms of your own work.
Okay. I mean, I think when we look at investigative reporting in general, I would not define impact by awards, but I certainly would define impact by does change occur, whether that be changing of a law, public awareness of an issue that the public hadn't been aware of before, elected official who is ousted or has to change their behavior, a change in a policy, a recall. I mean, there's lots of different ways to kind of measure an actual impact of the work. And I definitely think impact can also just be measured in, have we told the public about something that they otherwise wouldn't have known about, and they can make different decisions and more informed decisions based on that information. Now, when I talk about impact of my own work, I always say I write about things that will never change. So I've had to really think about impact in a different way, because when I spent the first decade and a half of my career writing about school segregation and housing segregation, I knew full well I could expose segregation. I could even expose the way public officials were drawing school attendance zone maps in a way to segregate kids, and those maps were not going to change, that segregation was not going to change, there wasn't going to be this kind of popular uprising of will to try to force change. And so I both had to tell myself that really my job, my impact is bearing witness. My impact is not allowing us to pretend that we haven't chosen to do the things that we're doing. I really set out about a decade ago to show that you could treat investigative reporting as an investigative beat, that rather than the way we, what would I say?
That we treated
investigative reporting or racial, I meant to say, sorry. That you could treat racial inequality, as an investigative beat, that we had tended to treat racial inequality as just kind of a cataloging of maladies, very superficial reporting about this marginalized community of color suffering from XYZ, as if no one were causing that suffering, as if you couldn't go to institutions and show the policies that were being created, the way that inequality was being enforced. And so I wanted to show that you could prove that people were actually making decisions that were leading to that inequality. But again, understanding that it wasn't going to actually probably change the behaviors of our elected officials, but I wasn't going to allow either those officials, those policymakers, or us as a public to pretend that there was an inevitability to it all or innocence about it. And I guess the last thing I'll say, outside of my seeing impact as kind of bearing witness or holding the mirror, is I've certainly had impact in terms of laws being changed, but not in the way an investigative reporter would hope. You know, one can certainly say, you know, I have contributed, my work has contributed to book bans, to states passing policies about divisive concepts, states passing policies and laws to prevent certain things from being taught in the classroom. To this day, there's a federal bill by Senator Mitch McConnell and Tom Cotton called the Saving American History Act, which seeks to defund public schools for teaching the 1619 Project and the 1619 Project only. So that's impact as well, I suppose. Though certainly not, you know, when you set out to be a reporter, you don't imagine that there will be those types of laws being passed because of your work, but it certainly does speak to, you don't see those types of laws being passed by folks who are not concerned about impact of the work, who are not concerned about feeling that there is some power dynamic that has shifted that they need to control, but I wouldn't say those laws are a positive of my work, no.
And I'm going to come back to that.
Okay.
Kevin.
You know, there's a lot to come back to.
Yeah.
But no, I think this being the, I guess this is the last session of the day before we head to the cocktails. No, I just want to take a moment first to just say that how many gems were dropped today. I was picking them all up, you know, putting them in my pocket. There were so many great insights. And I mean, I'm gonna go back to something as it relates to this question that David Barstow started with when he said that, you know, no one else is, you know, coming to save us. You know, we have to save ourselves, and the work we do. You know, I think the notion of collaboration and how we support each other is very important. And in some ways, it breaks the notion of competition that was so embedded in the work that everybody's got to race to the story and get there first and beat. And now you see you see collaboration within cities, news organizations in cities and states and across. And I think that's a good thing for the profession and for human beings, right? I think that's impact. You know, when we talk about impact, like, can we coalesce around topics? You know, I want to like try to broaden the definition of impact because, you know, just thinking of Nikole here, and I said it when the 1619 Project came, it was first there. I remember I sent her a text early. It really was one of the most defining things I've ever seen done. And it starts with like, can you even do that work inside of a newsroom? You know, because once you do it, I can't tell you how many other people in the news will say, I want to do some version of the 1619 Project. But in a good way, like that's a level of ambition, but also impact in how we think about the country, the founding of it, and what happened after that, and a link between the beginning of the country and now. And that's redefining an idea, you know, that's central to who we are as human beings. So that's impact. And I think there are lots of ways to measure impact, including, can you pioneer work that's different? Like every tool has not been used. Every kind of thing to be done in investigative reporting hasn't been used. Like my former colleague, one of my former colleagues, David Farenthold, was looking at, and he's not the only one, but I know when they were looking at the Trump's philanthropy and started out on that project. He did a lot of crowdsourcing for it, used social media, and it also created the notion and shared his work, shared his tips along the way, got tips, asked people out in the world for help, and that became a kind of way to do that work that others have. The social media is not just a place to post and get trolled, and you can actually use it as a resource very creatively. So there's just a lot of ways to measure impact when you can lay down some breadcrumbs and people pick them up, right? And so there's always the traditional ways. We can get more into those, which I support, because if you can get, if you can reveal something about the Catholic Church, you know, in a deep way, and that, man, changes the whole conversation about what the Catholic Church is and what priesthood is, that's fantastic. But everything is not going to do that. And sometimes I think there's this pressure, you do this work, you spend all this time, that there has to be, all right, Congressional Subcommittee A is investigating, you know, and that's the follow. But okay, is that really impact because a committee of Congress or state government investigators? I think maybe it was Jamie Calvin earlier said something very, very smart about the investigation being its own cover-up, right? Like the investigation opens and it never ends, and it outlives the scandal. So maybe that's not always impact. And I'll stop right there for now.
So I want to go back to this notion of bearing witness, Nikole, and ask if you've thought about the impact of your work. Like when you started as a journalist, did you go into this thinking, all right, I'm going to do this? I know you said you realized things probably wouldn't change, but were you thinking as you created whatever work, okay, this is going to have some impact? Or were you thinking, okay, I'm just bearing witness, I don't know what's going to happen, but I am showing what is happening in a community, I'm showing what is happening with school segregation? And if it was something where you weren't thinking about impact in, I guess, sort of the traditional way we think about it, was there pushback? Did you feel any pressure to create impactful work, so to speak, to create change?
So I don't think anyone gets into journalism without wanting to have impact. This is a profession that draws people who believe in the power of not just bearing witness, but of digging, of exposing, of informing. Our founders were deeply flawed. I've written quite a bit about that, but one of the things, of course, that they understood was that a free society has to have a free press, and that not only does a free press require democracy, but a democracy requires a free press. So when I decided I wanted to be a journalist, I mean, I probably started thinking about becoming a journalist when I was 11 years old. When I got my first letter to the editor published in my local newspaper about Jesse Jackson's primary run. It might tell you how painfully nerdy I was as a child. It was not cute, y'all. But, you know, I just remember I as this 11-year-old child was thinking that Jesse Jackson was a really great candidate. And I'm in rural Iowa, or not, I'm in Iowa, which is a rural state, and the first in the nation primary. So I wrote about the fact that I didn't think he did very well in our state because he was black, and that we hadn't really given him a chance. And every day I would go look in the newspaper, turn to the opinion page, and one day they published it. And that felt empowering, even as an 11-year-old child, to know that you could see something that you felt was wrong or unjust in the world. And I couldn't change the outcome of the election, obviously, but I could force people to think about it. So to me, that's what journalism does. And I always understood my impact as, I'll just quickly tell another story. You know, I grew up in Waterloo, Iowa. Not a lot of black people in Iowa, but we had the most proportionally black people in the state of Iowa at about 15%, so we were blacker than the nation. And I would read the newspaper every day with my dad, And if I wanted to read about Black people, we would literally go to the crime log. That was the only place they told stories about Black folks. But as a kid, I'm like, I live in a Black neighborhood, and I know most people I see every day are not committing crimes. And yet, we are not in any other part of the newspaper. So I wanted to be a journalist because I knew that there were stories about my community that weren't being told, that our community was not being reflected as it should. I didn't even think about being an investigative reporter. I just wanted to be a reporter who wrote about my community. Of course, as you become a journalist, so you understand the power of investigation, that not only could I write about the community, but I could write about the way that power was being wielded against our communities, and that so many of the ways Black people were living was because of decision makers, people in power who were making decisions to cause that to be so. And so much of my reason for wanting to be a journalist was not to feel like I was powerless in a society where power seemed very hard to come by. And I still feel that way, that journalism, looking at what's happening in the country right now, so many people feel absolutely powerless, but I don't. And I don't because I can see things that I still think are unjust. I can see the story, the angle that I don't think is being exposed, and I can give that information to the public who may or may not do shit with it, because a lot of times they don't, right? But they know. There is a power to knowing. So I don't know what I thought my career would be, certainly not what it's become. I mean, when you grow up in Waterloo, Iowa, your dreams aren't quite that big. I just wanted to write about Black people for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which never hired me, by the way, and it's okay. It worked out. But I did understand that we do have a unique power, that narrative is what drives policy, not. We all know this from our work, right? You can go out and do this investigation, you can expose these things, and someone else has a better narrative, and all your data, all your research, all your facts, all your reporting, it doesn't matter. You've got to have that narrative. And if we aren't able to steer the narrative, to me, towards justice, y'all, if you know me, you know I don't believe in neutrality. I don't believe in journalistic neutrality. I think. Now I'm just going on a tangent, so let me just end this. But I think, especially now in these times, I think that it is an abdication of our duty to pretend to be neutral in a country that is losing its democracy. I think it is, journalistic neutrality is not truth, and it is not adhering to the role that we are to play as a fourth estate. And I've never believed that. I always believed that our job was to put our foot on the scale for equality, for progress, and for the vulnerable, and that to me is the true impact. I don't speak for the voices. Every person has a voice. We just ignore the voices of a lot of people. And our job is to, as the last news organization, the Lightning Talk, is to be that spotlight. I don't even remember what your question was, but that's my answer.
I guess, Kevin, to build on that and the notion of not being neutral, so to speak, I think there are places that would say that if you're thinking about impact, you're moving into sort of advocacy journalism. You're moving in terms of you want a desired outcome, and so you're going to report for that desired outcome. And I want to get your thoughts on that. Like, if you're going into a project thinking about a desired impact, does that then affect the way that you report the story and maybe make it so that you're not doing what you should be doing as a journalist?
I mean, it could, but it doesn't happen. I don't think journalists, we're like the rest of society. There's not. We're not a monolith, right? Like, everybody comes from someplace. They grew up someplace, they were informed by all kinds of things, their parents, their religion, their race, ethnicity, gender. They're informed about, do they like soul music, or do they like golf, I think there's just a lot of things that go into making a journalist. And so when it comes to, I think, pursuit of the story, like, that's one thing I think we can all agree as journalists, like, a great story. Let's go after it, you know? And I think the hallmark of investigative reporting, the best of it, is really going after something, not being deterred, right? A kind of fearlessness that won't stop, you know, won't be thwarted. And that's the thing, I think, you know, the impact will happen if you do the work. You do great work, you're gonna get an impact, you know, of some kind. It doesn't always the kind we want, you know? You know, you said that earlier, right? Somebody said that it's not always the kind of impact we want, you know, a major law being changed or something. But look, I mean, I remember the project that Tampa Bay Times did, and our friend Corey Johnson was part of it. Yep. And, you know, recycling plant, you know, highly toxic, you know, impact on workers. Who are those workers? Impact in the communities, neighborhoods close by. And one of the things he said, to be able to get that report, spent a lot of time in a community, happened to be black community, trying to get people's respect and their sense of trust in a place, by his telling, you know, that maybe didn't always have that. His institution he worked for didn't always have that trust. So you got to break down those walls. If you get that trust, that's impact. Like, you go and you become determined to do the work. Maybe some of the doors you knocked on, people said, man, get out of here. You Tampa Bay Times? Get the fuck out of here, you know? But you keep coming back and figuring out how to do that. Now, once that investigation gets published, sure, it won a Pulitzer Prize, a bunch of other awards. But that long-term benefit is to the Tampa Bay Times, right? And credit to the reporters helping to stitch together a better relationship. So next time they go with an investigation, maybe it's easier. And now we got more stories that are coming out. So I think impact is not always like, it's not like, let me see, am I gonna take down a president? If everybody's looking at Watergate, right? And I know when I said president, everybody's thinking of Donald Trump, right? And there's been a lot of great work. That man right there is in front has done a lot of it, and many other people have done a lot of it. But I got in journalism in part because of Watergate. I mean, Watergate had an influence on me for sure. It was, you know, I went into journalism school at a time when it was the hottest profession going, you know. Everybody wanted to do it, and big stars, you know, were representing Woodward and Bernstein, and that's literally taking down a president. And so if everything, you start with that bar, right? I got to take down a president, or I got to do something like that, then you are chasing, you know? I think you can get distracted with work, and that's why, as an editor, I try to get that out of reporters' heads. Well, don't think about it. Let's do the work and figure out what happens afterwards, you know, and be relentless about the work.
Can I want to challenge the framing of the question a bit, because when people say you will be accused of using, you know, journalism as advocacy, I don't understand what that means, because I don't understand how we think journalism is not advocacy. When I know that it's okay. The applause can be tepid. I get it. It's okay. But just think about the motto of the Washington Post: "Democracy dies in darkness." That is not neutral, right? That is saying our job as a free press is to protect democracy. When an investigative reporter exposes the way that Child Protective Services has failed children and those children have died, they're not doing it just because they think it would be interesting for the public to know or it's a good story. They're doing it because they want these institutions to serve their purpose and serve them well. So I think we have to, you know, this idea of journalistic objectivity, of that journalism wasn't advocacy, is a fairly new idea. And I think it's wrong. And I think it leaves a lot of us confused. Yes, if your position is I want to take someone down and you go in, that is problematic. Obviously, right? And I think you will then make reporting mistakes. There's a hubris to that. But if your job is someone is giving me a tip and this institution that is supposed to be protecting the vulnerable is not, and I am going to find out why and who did it so that can change, that is advocacy. And I don't understand why we would want to say that it's not. I have never pretended that I just wanted to be a journalist so that I could be a stenographer, right? So I could just tell good stories. No, we want our society to be better. And why should we not hold on to that? Why should not, I mean, in a time where we are not the most vaunted profession, right? Where I'm always shocked that people still do want to come be journalists. That is something to me that every day, like every day I feel purpose. Like I never wake up, people are like, how do you keep doing it with the attacks? I'm like, this is the greatest shit ever. Like I have the best enemies in the world. Like why would I not want to do this? And so if this is the last session, so like, let's be called into our purpose as journalists, like why we exist as journalists.
Yeah.
And be okay with that.
Yeah. And I agree. I agree with you. And I have a question, though, about how that thinking has been received for both of you over the course of your career, because I will say that I started teaching 17 years ago, and at that time, journalism was taught in a particular way. And over time, you know, you get younger students in, you as a professor getting older, and I've seen a shift, from other professors saying, okay, this story that you pitched student X, like that's not journalism, that's advocacy, because you have a point of view, you have a thing that you think is unjust, and you are trying to, you know, report on that and expose that and show people what is happening. And the pushback in terms of it being advocacy, it's like, we are journalists, we're not advocates. And that's messaging that I have heard in journalism schools, like, you know, over the course of my career. And so I'm curious for you, and for both of you, have you had pushback against that? Is it something that you felt like, okay, this is my mission, this is my purpose, I know why I'm doing this, I don't necessarily need to broadcast it, I'm just gonna do this work? But has there been pushback for either one of you earlier in your career, or even, I mean, now, in terms of having a purpose, as Nikole said?
I just spoke.
You
so
just
I feel
spoke.
like-
I mean, look, I think, you know, I have to like go back into the recesses of my, of my mind to think, has there been pushback? I'm sure. I look at it like it's obvious, right? We can't pretend like journalists are just people who don't have feelings and don't have ideas and are robots that don't think. That you care about a topic or subject or a community or something, you know, that you care about something, then to me it means that you are actually a human being, right? And we can't like strip that from people. So to get to your question of the pushback, I think, you know, I'm sure there was, you know, if in the course of my career, I mean, I try to do a lot of different things in the course of my career, including what Nikole said about covering my community. If at least one of my communities is the Black community, it's not my only community. I've covered my basketball community. You know, I've done a lot of things about athletes because I love sports. So these are things I care about. They interest me, right? Race and inequality, and they interest me. So I've looked at it, right, as a journalist, and so it's not problematic. I think if people do try to push back against anybody that wants to take on something that they care about, as an editor, you're never going to get my endorsement of that, right? Because I think people should. We have a project right now. I think, well, I'm saying we still, even though I'm not at the LA Times. But I believe is a project looking at queer community, you know, and it was a very sweeping thing. I'm probably not supposed to be saying that, but I'm not here anymore. But yeah, but it was based on, you know, one of, you know, a number of the gay journalists came together and they had some ideas about coverage, and they developed that inside the LA Times. I was the first to say I support it, you know, and the way it was developed. So is that going to be seen as somehow there's something wrong with that, you know, because they have some feelings about that? I think it's going to make it excellent. And I know they happen to invoke 1619 in the process of it, because they wanted to interrogate some things that they thought had not been properly interrogated.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one, early in my career, I certainly faced a lot of pushback, and I've talked about nearly being run out of the industry, not because of a sense that my reporting wasn't objective, so Wes Lowry and I have very similar ideas about what is objectivity, and we talk about objectivity of method. So it's not pretending as a human being, as a black woman, as a girl who grew up in a working class community, as a girl who grew up in Iowa, that these things are not shaping the lens through which I tell stories, how I tell stories. I mean, the greatest example to me is the reporting that Wes and the Washington Post did about police violence, right? The fact that many white journalists were ignoring the level of violence that police commit regularly against black communities, that many white journalists were taking the police version of the story as fact, the only people we allow to commit a crime and investigate the crime themselves, and we take that as fact, right? Look at the first story of Walter Scott that came out. Look at the first story of Eric Garner, where literally citizens had to bypass the mainstream media and go to social to expose a problem that every black journalist knew was happening. We were told that was objective reporting. It was not, right? These were reporters who were reporting on police based on their experiences with police, based on how police their communities, and it was not objective. So what's important is, yes, this is why we want diverse newsrooms in the first place. It's not for some, you know, DEI initiative. Got it? Okay. But right, it improves your report. It means your report is actually reflecting the reality of your communities, the reality of the world. And so to tell us then to come into these newsrooms and not report through that lens means you don't actually want diversity. You don't actually want a multiracial press that reflects multiracial democracy. But what we need, and what I tell my students, one, I don't want to hear my students' opinions on a bunch of things. I want you to use that experience to go report and come back with stories and have objectivity of method, which means, are your facts right? Is your reporting fair? That is what's important, but not pretending that it's okay for police to kill unarmed citizens. Not pretending that I think school segregation is okay. No one would read anything that I wrote and think that I think school segregation is okay. But what you can't dispute is the reporting. You can't dispute the facts. You can't dispute the data. So to me, that's what I tell my students is, of course you feel things. I mean, the only thing that we don't have opinions on are things that we don't know anything about. And as soon as we know something about them, we form opinions on them. And actually being honest with yourself that these are the biases I have means you can report against those biases. But too often what we have are people who deny they have them, and then when those biases are pointed out, they get defensive, and then they publish shit that's shit, right? And then after the fact, then they have these communities coming at them, and they're losing trust instead of gaining trust. So I just think we should be more honest as a profession and use that. Like when I know I have a bias in, then when I'm going in for that interview, I'm being extra careful. I'm checking everything. I am checking constantly against my bias because I don't want a blind spot that will be exposed when I publish. And then something I've worked on for 8 months can be discredited because I haven't been honest with myself about those blind spots. This is the way that I teach my students to think about it. But I want my students to be passionate. I want my students to say, I see this thing in my community that I think is not fair. And you know, when you're college students, they want to go to protests. They want to engage. And I was like, that's not your role. Your role is to expose the thing that they're protesting about. right? Your role, and use your activism in that way. But instead, we try to beat that spirit out of students. We try to tell our students, you shouldn't feel anything. Why would you want that? The best journalism is a journalism that we have a passion about, that we say this thing is wrong, and I'm going to expose it, and hopefully something will change. So that's how I see it. I see it as not pretending to be personally objective, but trying to ensure that your methods are as objective as possible.
So do you think that there has been a shift then in terms of how we see impactful journalism? Like, so obviously the 1619 Project has had impact in the sense of people thinking about an issue differently. It's also had impact in terms of, you know, Kevin mentioning that people wanting to do projects that are similar to yours about, you know, whatever the issue is that people are passionate about. But I'm curious to know if you think that how we sort of define investigative journalism in particular, but how we look at journalism, what we consider to be impactful journalism, if you think that has changed over time. And I guess one measure of this, and I'm going to throw this to you, Kevin, we, again, look at prizes in terms of like this industry. We will measure someone's impact as a journalist and their work in terms of what prizes did you win for this. And as someone who's on the Pulitzer board, do you see a change in terms of what is entered for these prizes, in terms of what is winning, in terms of, I mean, I know you can't obviously go into discussions, but in terms of what we consider to be
break some news here today.
No, we're not gonna break any news.
in terms of impactful.
But we'll have news in like a month.
Yeah.
You know, I do think it's changing, like all of our professions evolving. I think the same discussions, I mean, the Pulitzer board, which I sit on, and Sul Chan as well, like the rest of the industry, like we're trying to make our presence felt, right? And do the best work and figure out how to get it consumed more, right? And get more places to do it. And how the awards are handed out, how they're handed out, I mean, how they're considered, even the discussion, you know, with our group is evolving. And so I think the kind of discussions that we have in the board, I mean, includes, you know, changing, you know, can you add categories? Can you change categories? I mean, one of the things that I know I loved back we don't have anymore is beat reporting, because the thing about prizes, they tend to be given for big, massive projects, you know, not all the time, but they do, right? And the luxury to work on those is held by some, but not all, right? And a lot of places can't do the kind of work that wins a lot of those big prizes. And so back when there was beat report, I mean, you know, I would say, like, just to give a call out to one of my former colleagues, Aileen Chekmedian, you know, who was covering the sheriff's department, doing some of the most impactful work on a beat with a sheriff, that lots of abuses inside jails and with the deputy sheriffs, and you know, that's a drumbeat of just constant, rigorous reporting, and that deserves some awards too, right? Like, that deserves recognition, you know? People every day covering the beat. And so I think it's evolving like the craft is. You know, we have things called visual investigations now. Like, that's a whole category of investigations, and it's important. And we should give that some lift, encourage others to do it. But I think prizes are important if they can be spread widely so that everybody can win them, right? So that there's some, you know, people feel like they can do work no matter where you are. And so that people say, wow, here's a little place that's doing great work. I mean, some of the best work, a lot of people started doing opioid work, and that's another, but the Charleston paper in West Virginia, you know, won a Pulitzer for some tremendous work under a lot of pressure. They called attention to that opioid crisis. Like, I think they had the highest rate in the nation. There's a lot of work being done around the country, but it helped to shine a light on a very big problem, and a lot of others picked up on it. So I think it's important to call out when people are doing original work, when they're doing it against great odds and maybe limited resources. There's lots of ways to give prizes. And I think, you know, in the Pulitzer board, and Sewell can either co-sign or say, nah, I think we try to look at a lot of factors and widen the range of factors we look at when giving awards, giving that prize.
I mean, look, I love awards. And Lord knows our profession gives more awards than any profession on the planet.
More than academia? More than academia?
I think so. I really do. But to me, when I look at what has changed, and this is something, I'm going to tell you something that inspires me and something that worries me. So what worries me, obviously, is it's harder and harder to be able to do investigative reporting for obvious reasons. Used to be most local papers had investigative reporters. Now we don't even have as many local papers, and less resources into the really long-term investigations. I don't have to tell anyone in this room how dangerous it is to communities and democracies that we're losing so many local reporters, so many State House reporters, just how much dirt we know is being done on a daily basis that is never being covered in the places that have the most impact, which is obviously not in Washington, D.C. And that worries me. And what also worries me then is that also means I'm not exactly sure how the generation of students that I'm teaching become investigative reporters. Because I became an investigative reporter from being a beat reporter, not from working at an online publication with an editor who wasn't sitting next to me, helping me figure out how I was going to get this story, coming up with my reporting plan, going over the interview questions with me, going over the strategy, and then when I come back, sitting side by side and editing with me and helping me figure out, okay, you don't have this yet. This is the whole. There's just fewer and fewer ways for students to get, young journalists to get that type of critical training. I didn't start as an investigative reporter. I started as a beat reporter. I covered Durham public schools and I covered county government. My first big investigation came as a beat reporter about a fair housing sting, and that led to me going to ProPublica and doing my first major investigation. So I worry about that. I just don't know what the training ground is. You can't learn this in the academic classroom, right? Our profession is a trade, and you learn by doing. I sat next to, you know, reporters in my newsroom at the Oregonian, and I said, I don't actually know how to manage all of this report. Like, what is your organizational system for all of these documents and reporting that you're doing? Because I don't know how to do this. I just don't think I don't know where they're getting that these days. And if they get...
David's saying UC Berkeley, right?
Right, and you know, I'm working with David because I'm trying to build something like that at Howard and a consortiums at HBCUs, but most of our kids aren't going to get access to that. They just aren't, and so that scares me because we clearly need that, and we clearly need those students and young journalists to be able to get that type of training, and it's becoming really difficult to do that. So yes, we have to build these, but most students aren't going to Cal Berkeley, right? So I worry about that. But the thing that inspires me is something that you talked about earlier, which is the collaboration. So I was lucky enough to be a cub reporter in a news town that still had 2 daily newspapers, which was in Durham. So I worked for the News and Observer and the Durham Bureau, and we competed against the Durham Herald-Sun, and that was fucking awesome. Like, I loved, right, that sense of competition. But now what I love is that, like, we are competing against like the wrongdoers. Like instead of competing against each other, I love the sense of collaboration of newsrooms working with each other against the bad guys, right? And that's actually an amazing way to do news that you would have never seen. Like there would have never been, I mean, no freaking way would like we have collaborated with the Durham Herald Sun on a story, right? You were just trying to like beat their ass every day. But now you see these news organizations that are working together for like the good of community, and as we're seeing our ranks eroding, we are seeing a power and understanding like we're all on the same side here, and I think that is inspiring to me.
Absolutely.
You're thinking of that? Oh, you're going to say something.
No, I was just co-signing on that point.
So beyond collaborations, do you see any other, I guess, rays of hope or ways forward? Because there's the lack of resources, so that's the one thing, newspapers and other outlets closing. And then there's also the lack of trust. So obviously there are some communities that historically have not trusted journalists, but as we become the enemy of the people, there's the erosion of that as well. So do you see, I mean, obviously these are negatives and these are things that are impacting the profession, but do you see other ways forward in addition to collaboration? Like what else should we be doing?
I mean, you only get one hopeful thing out of me a session, so I gave you what I had.
That's why I'm going to Kevin. Kevin's going to offer more hope.
You know, look, I think we can widen our profession even more. I think we talked about collaborations, and that part's good. They mostly have been in the traditional news orders. I think we can stretch that. There's a lot of room to grow where you're partnering with new startups and small places and communities that are maybe more connected to those communities. And interest groups, I don't mean interest groups in the way they talk about it in Congress, you know, coming to lobby the Hill, but I think about places that, you know, may be more tethered to a place, so you don't have to parachute into the place. And I think we can, you know, there's room to do that. And so that's one thing. I think, you know, the degree to which there are, we talk about citizen journalists and people in their community documenting their own stories. I think there's ways to work with people documenting their own stories and letting us see that more, letting readers see, you know, the documentation. You know, George Floyd, you know, that happened because there was a teenager who didn't move, right? And we gave her a special citation as a Pulitzer citation, and she was just there and didn't move, right? And filmed the whole thing. And I think, you know, there's something to be said by that, right? Like the authenticity, because we're always talking about authenticity, and there's lots of ways to get authenticity, you know, and some of it is you got to go right to the source, you know. And so I think there are rooms. I'm just mulling this as you ask the question, and I don't have an idea, but I think we have to kind of keep thinking about how we find ways to penetrate communities and places that are not accessible to us. You know, I came from a place in you know, I think people know I just left the LA Times, and you know, LA is a really big, sprawling place. You know, it's just huge. And when I was there, I would run into people and they would say, "I've never seen a reporter." Like, not that I never saw a reporter from LA Times. I've never had a reporter come here into the thing I'm doing. And that's everything from a particular Vietnamese community or a subculture of music, you know, that's happening, something that's really important happening, never seen a reporter. So you know that we're not everywhere. And I think that is trying to be everywhere, you're not going to get everywhere. Some stories you're just not going to discover unless we find ways to have, you know, more listening posts and more of our own kind of community correspondence and people that tell us stuff. So I don't know. I don't know what the method is of that, but I just think we got to kind of broaden our way of thinking and being as journalists.
A question for you, Nikole, in terms of what can come with having produced impactful work. So obviously the 1619 Project has had a lot of positive impact, but it has also led to backlash and you being attacked personally. And I want to know how, I guess, one, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that?
So it's obviously, again, knowing the audience, it's not unusual for investigative reporters or, 1619 Project was not an investigative report, it was historically informed journalism, but to face attack and scrutiny for their work. And I did not get into journalism, I imagine none of us did, to make powerful people comfortable. Like, there's an expectation. And frankly, had I produced the 1619 Project and there was no pushback, I would have considered the project a failure because I wasn't trying to tell a comforting story, a familiar story. I was trying to push back against the settled narrative of the United States, just that small little goal. But even with that said, I would be lying if I said I predicted or expected the level of pushback, the opposition research, the attacks going all the way to the White House, the attempts to really discredit me as a journalist in order to discredit the work. So if you ask, how did I deal with it? Well, if y'all follow me on Twitter, you would know not always well. I was clearly the bane of my bosses at the New York Times existence on Twitter because it was hard. I mean, I'm not being like falsely humble to say I didn't ever expect to be at the New York Times. I didn't expect to have this platform. I thought I would be a journalist at a regional paper and most people wouldn't know my name and I would just be doing the work. And that's kind of how I've always thought about myself. And then one day, all of a sudden, you've become this symbol, a symbol to people who love you, and that feels amazing, but also a symbol to people who hate you. But in my mind, I'm still like Nikole Hannah-Jones with 300 Twitter followers who has time. And I had a lot of time because also this is happening at the height of the pandemic. So I'm at home every day, and all I have to do is just read every single word that's being written about me and feeling like I'm going to respond to every word. And sometimes I would respond, and then I'd actually look up the bio of the person. I was like, this person had 5 followers. So there were dark moments, and my good friends would call and tell me to put the phone down. And sometimes I'd listen, sometimes I wouldn't. Often I wouldn't. So yeah, it wasn't easy, and I was doing, I think, something that journalists do a lot. I was drinking too much. I wasn't being as careful with, the work was going to stand, and it actually took a very dear friend of mine who told me at one point, he said, Nikole, you've won. The fact that all of these powerful people are attacking your work means you've won, and they can't discredit your work, but you can. And that shit hurt, but it was true, right? It was true. Like the work was going to stand, but like the way I was engaging on social media and allowing myself to be drawn in was starting to discredit the work because something I was dashing off quickly was being used against work that I had spent months and months and months reporting and writing, and that was a hard lesson to learn, but I learned it. So now, if you notice, I don't argue with people on Twitter at all. I have found the block button to be very therapeutic, and I just move on. I read it, I will type a response, and then I'll delete it and move on. I still have to type it out, but I don't send it. So again, and I don't, like, I'm never woe is me. Like I never thought I could produce a project that would have the impact of this, especially a project on slavery. I'm grateful even for my haters. Like Donald Trump has sold a lot of 1619 books. And again, you know, I mean, I was on a panel at NABJ last year, and it was a panel of journalists talking about, you know, the threats that journalists face and the attacks. And I'm like, I don't face, there are journalists who actually are facing like real attacks. I just face Twitter attacks. Like I always try to have perspective that there are folks out here doing serious work. There are journalists who are losing their lives. There are journalists who are being completely doxxed and having their lives turned upside down. And I have, you know, former presidents saying mean things about me on Twitter. Like I keep perspective. And in the end, you know, my Twitter handle is named after Ida B. Wells, and I just always level set with myself. This was like a woman who was barely 5 foot tall, who was going into a place where a black person had just been lynched and having the audacity to ask questions. She wasn't working for the New York Times. In fact, the New York Times called her a slanderous and nasty-minded mulattress. Right, she had no protection of mainstream organizations. She didn't have someone who could send a security detail if you wanted that, or who could come to your house and outfit your house with security cameras. They had none of these things, and most journalists don't have those things. And yet she did her work every day. And so, you know, what choice do I have? What complaints can I possibly have? So now, I don't drink that much, though. I will drink a bourbon if you buy me one. And really just try to understand, like, this is the biggest gift one could receive as a journalist, is that you could produce something that people care enough about to argue about 5 years later. They're still arguing about it.
And so I have been instructed to move on to questions. If you have questions, please come up to the mic.
What brand of bourbon? Was that the question? No, I'm playing.
Brand is not a bad brand. I'll join with you with the bourbon.
Right.
Hi, my name is Danny Feingold. I'm the publisher and founder of Capital in Maine, which I started a decade ago to report on economic inequality and its close cousin, racial inequality. The premise, and it was refreshing to hear you talk about the Washington Post and its democracy dies in darkness. Nobody thinks that that's advocacy. It's simply a statement of fact. And I would argue the same thing is true about the pervasive impacts of economic inequality across the country. My question is, do you feel that the American media at this moment in time, when we're living through a moment of extreme economic inequality and concentration of wealth, is doing enough to report on economic inequality? And to the extent that the answer might be no, is it a hesitancy to move into the territory, perceived territory of advocacy journalism, or is it simply complacency, accepting something that's become normalized?
She's looking at me, I'm looking at her. You know, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I do think the answer is no. They're not doing enough. But man, I think on a lot of issues that we, you know, their complacency may be the right term. You take a condition for granted that it is what it is. You can outrage, but we may not know how to interrogate it as a subject. I think that's one of the things about journalism. It's like sometimes I think we don't do enough on subjects because we haven't figured out what to do on them and how to do that work. And I think that's where the rigor comes in, you know. And you see these statistics that come out, you know, and man, it's really present in California, where I live in LA. Seems like every month there's some new statistics showing the gap and the number of millionaires and the percentage being increased, the number of people leaving the state and the city, the lack of affordable housing, the growing homelessness population, just a series of things that you're trying to get your arms around. But I think it's kind of like a call to arms. Sometimes you need some call to arms of just like, and that's where newsrooms are great in places. Somebody to say, let's sit and figure it out. Let's take on this as a big subject. And sometimes when news organizations take it on as a big subject, it gives people a path, and others can say, all right, let me go grab a piece of that story. But I do believe that that's one of the biggest issues of our time that needs more reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a lot to add to that. I feel like that was a rhetorical question, in that we know we do a poor job of covering income inequality, of covering poverty outside of covering it in a way that pathologizes the poor, and rarely gets to all of the structures that lead to poverty. This is why I think so many of us, particularly those of us who come from quote-unquote marginalized communities, have never bought into the mythology of the objective newsroom, right? Because everything is about choices. You have a cops beat, but you don't have a poverty beat. That's a choice. Instead, you cover poverty through crime, right? As opposed through social policy. I think newsrooms are made up of many people, especially these days as we become more professionalized, who have no personal experience with poverty, who don't spend much time at all in communities that suffer from poverty, that drop in and drop out, usually again for crime coverage, and that's reflected in our daily report. But also say, I think we struggle in general with how do you cover, again, these deeply entrenched, complicated societal issues. It's one thing to like go into an agency and show wrongdoing of particular people in an agency. It's quite something else, like how many stories are we going to write about this, right? How do we keep, because, the way newsrooms work is once I've written about it, I can't write about it again for a while, which you have to do. You just look at how we're covering the election. What substantial issues are we talking about at all in our daily coverage? What stories on the education policy of the candidates, right? What stories on the economic policies of the candidates? Like I do think that there is something somewhat broken in our field about how we're covering a lot of these issues, but particularly the issues of income inequality. And I think particularly because we feel to cover it correctly, we would be taking a side. And I think we should be taking a side here if we, again, are called into our mandate. But there's so much broken with the structure of how we write about it. Like, what's the big investigation you do into income inequality, right? And how do you then sustain that coverage, particularly in a place where we have fewer and fewer investigative reporters, less and less money to spend on it. Like, I even wonder now, could I do like my one-year investigations into school segregation and get the resources to do that when I have to tell my editors when this publishes nothing's going to come of this, right? Would they support it now as opposed to when I was doing this 10 years ago? I don't know. So, you probably have a better answer to this than I do. But I do think there's something fundamentally broken about the way we cover many of these deeply entrenched societal issues, but particularly having to do with the poor and income inequality. I said I didn't have much to add, and then I talked for like 5 minutes. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Madeline Bear. I'm the founding director of El Tímpano. We cover and serve Latino and Indigenous Mayan immigrants here in the Bay Area. And when I was first getting started, a few people told me journalism that just focuses on reaching Latino immigrants won't make a difference. And some of them were journalists, and some of them were funders. And my question, maybe for you, Kevin, as someone who sits as a Pulitzer judge, but really for all of you, is how can we as an industry change this notion that for journalism to make an impact, it has to reach, public radio listeners or New York Times readers?
Yeah, I certainly don't agree with that, right? being in LA, it's very, we created a whole new, we stood up another vertical, a whole new site that was focusing on Latino identity, culture, with, all Latino staff. And I think, there was not the sense that was important for the institution, to do it. It was not the sense that was a separate thing that was just gonna reach a small audience. It was intended to have the perspective of these journalists, shine a light on a broad range of subjects that were both the kind of things that were being talked about inside Latino communities, and broadcast that to the larger audience. Give them a seat, You get a special ticket, to be inside the culture. And so I think there are lots of different models for the reporting and trying to reach audiences. I think there has been kind of this idea that in some places that we write too much about immigrants and the stories are always the same. But I think that is a reflection of just that I think, I'm making a generalization, we broadly treat the immigrant population as a small population. I mean, at the LA Times, we did a survey to show how wide and disparate the immigrant population is. We did probably like one of the most significant polling projects with Kaiser Family Foundation that was a broad range of how the immigrant experience in this country, and not just Latino immigrants, but breaking it down with under specific populations within Latino communities, but outside, and comparing the immigrant experience. And so I just think like we have to be more sophisticated with the reporting and be more aggressive at telling a broader range of stories. I think in the Pulitzer board, I was thinking about, well, I can't remember the prize we gave not long ago. I'm blanking on it now. Was it Maria Hinojosa?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that was it?
That's
it.
it.
I thought I was making another point. I just want to quickly add something to that last question. I've been thinking about this a lot. We don't like to acknowledge as a profession that we actually set the agenda for the conversation, right? Because we don't see that as our role. We see our role as just reflecting. But if every day when we interviewed politicians, we were asking about economic policy, we were asking them about poverty, and we were writing a story every single time, they would talk about it, right? They would have to have an answer to that, but we don't. So we choose what it is. It's the same thing. You can look at the way that when gas was going up, we wrote a story about it every day. When gas goes down, we don't write about it at all. That's a choice of what we think is newsworthy and what's not. We wrote all those stories about surging crime, despite the evidence that crime was not surging. Now we're not writing about crime at all because crime is going down. So I think we don't acknowledge enough the way we set the agenda and the narrative around our country, and also what politicians think they have to address or not. If we felt that dealing with the rampant income inequality that we see rising all over the country was important, we would ask about it every day and we would report stories on it every day, and politicians would then have to address it. But because we don't, they don't. Y'all don't have to clap for everything I say, but I appreciate it. But it's also true.
What's going on, friends? How are you all? I got some questions I'll text you later, but one that I think is good for this venue. You guys talked about this a little bit, but I do think that one of the highest forms of impact of journalism is when the field begins mimicking the form in some ways. When we did Fatal Force at the Post, some of my colleagues would get very defensive if other organizations would do similar investigations, and I'd be like, no, this is dope.
Exactly.
They're just doing what I did that means that I did something right? Nikole, you mentioned something earlier, a framework where you're talking about the idea of historically informed journalism. How when you talk about 1619, we're talking about historically informed work. There are a lot of projects, a lot of organizations, a lot of journalists who are now seeking to do work in that space or increasingly leaning in to work in that space. And I see this with students who I work with and other folks. And so I thought it might be valuable for you to talk a little bit about what you think distinguishes historically informed journalism, in so much as you're one of the leading practitioners in this space, as are some other folks who are friends of ours and whatnot. What are the best practices? And for folks who want to bring more historically informed journalism into their publications, to their audiences, to their communities, where should they start? How should they be thinking about that?
Can I add to Wes's question?
No.
Yes. Should all journalism be historically informed?
Yeah, I mean, that was actually going to be my response. It's the same way that it's a hard question for me to answer because I don't know any other way to do journalism. And it's the same way that I tell my students all journalism is investigative. It's just a matter of how much time do you have to do it. That any of the techniques that you use in investigative reporting, you should be using in your daily reporting. I would make that same argument about historically informed. I call it historically informed because I'm trying to say we should be thinking more about this. But to me, I've never understood how could I be writing about any major policy, any major institution, and not understand the history of what built it, of how we got here. That you can't write about these things in a vacuum, and especially when you're an investigative reporter. I mean, I was thinking about, the example I use a lot is Freddie Gray, when Freddie Gray, of course, gets killed in Baltimore. And all of the reporting, as we like to do in those moments, is about right now, like what happened right now. But I know that, the city of Baltimore and the county of Baltimore and HUD had all been sued and found in violation of the Fair Housing Act, that Freddie Gray grew up in a neighborhood that had been created through social policy to deprive him and his community of resources, that he had been exposed to lead poisoning there, that lead poisoning leads to crime, like all of these things. And so you can write that story about that moment, and people will come away with no understanding of why that moment happened. And they'll come away actually, doing what they did, which Freddie Gray kind of probably deserved it. Or you can understand that history, and even if it's 2 paragraphs of context, you've given people something to say, something builds this moment. There's a larger societal thing that happens here. So I just think that all of our reporting, we can't know all history about all things, but this is probably why my articles now went from like 20 inches to 10,000 words. But even when I was a daily reporter, I always felt like I had to have an understanding of how did we get here? What is the history that built this? And even if I don't write that history is informing what I'm writing. It's informing the questions I'm asking. It's informing how I'm framing the story. So I'm trying to, teach that to my students, but also just to say, if you're writing 20 inches, you best have that history in your mind as you're writing those 20 inches, even if you can't write most of that history in there. And I just don't think enough of us study history. Enough of us ask, to speak to the people who can help us get the context for that moment, and we write about the now, and especially when you're writing about, these highly fraught situations where people already are coming in with so many stereotypes, right? They already think they know. I always say people will fill in the blanks. If you don't give them the information, they will fill in the blanks with their worst instincts. And that's not our job. Our job as reporters is try to help people get to the truth, and the truth is built on history. And frankly, I just think history is just fascinating. You don't have to be a nerd to understand how fascinating, because the thing is, you'll realize everything is in a historical pattern. And there's this process of discovery where you're like, oh my God, they did this in 1960. Oh, they already did a report on this, and they shelved the report, and the report said that this exactly was going to happen, and it happened, and you're able to really just give that contextualization. I think that is so critical for our work.
The only thing I would add, because I was just thinking about it, mine the archive. The archive
Love
is our
the
friend.
archives, yes.
You know, that's what documentary filmmakers do, right? Like, you can't make a great documentary with great archive. And I think in the helter-skelter where we do everything, not minding it enough, you know, when I first got to LA, shortly after, I met with this was still in COVID, met with the homelessness team, and editor, and framing the discussion, obviously a big issue in LA. The editor there had put together a timeline. You know, he had done that and passed it. That was a big, thick thing going back to like 1800s, you know, homelessness, late 1800s. And I was looking at the timeline, you know, I was just fascinated by it. And I was like, we need to do the narrative treatment of that timeline, because you forget how much some things you don't know and some things you've forgotten.
Yes.
Because people weren't around, like, and you're in LA, you think about homelessness as such, there's been so much great work and so many stories, and it's a big topic there. But you forget some of what happened in the early 1900s. You forget some of what happened during the Reagan era. You forget the composition of the homelessness. And if you don't go back, then, you know, you can't go forward, really. And so I think that's a good lesson for the big topics.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, I was thinking about the new Jim Crow. And so I'm a child who came of age in the 80s and the 90s. So I did not know a war on drugs, right? And so when you're like writing about crime, in the context that we've always done it this way, then you write about it that way. And then I read the new Jim Crow, and I'm like, oh, actually there was a time we didn't treat drugs this way.
Yeah.
And so if you have that grounding, then you're starting to look at the policy in a different way, and you're writing about it in a different way. So a lot of it, like, it's just actually helping you to understand the thing that you're seeing so you can translate that to the world. And it's not even, like, you don't even know you have the blind spot. Like, I never even questioned that this is how we treat, like, when I was coming up, the drug dealer was like the worst person in the black community, right? Like, worse than a murderer. Like, it was ingrained in your head that you had to treat people who sold drugs a certain way, and if we locked them up for 25 years, they were deserving because they were the worst people in the community. And then you read something that shows, oh, how this was constructed and how we actually used to treat this as an illness that needed treatment, then you write about it that way. And so I think so much of why history is important, again, is it allows us to see our own blind spots, our own biases, the way that we have accepted certain narratives about the way society is, and then that shows up in our reporting, and then we also then become part of the problem of furthering these really harmful narratives.
Okay, I've been told one last quick question.
You're the one.
Hi, my name's Emma Garcia. I'm from Salinas, California, and I'm also a student here at the J School. You know, I'm a second year, and I'm going to be launching into, early into my career, but I'm really passionate about my community, Salinas, California. But there's also a lot of, it's kind of in this limbo of being a news desert. And so there's a lot of reporting that needs to be done. And I guess I'm curious to know your advice for like people like me who are really passionate about their hometown and want to do investigative reporting, but there are not being publications to publish at or the resources to even kind of be the slightest bit successful in doing so. So
That's definitely for you to answer.
I support you. Come to UC Berkeley, we'll do a little flacking for David. Yeah, I think it's, I think now, and I don't want to be overly optimistic, I think if you have a good story and a passion about crime, there's somewhere to practice it. There's somewhere to help you. There's a fellowship program. There's some partnership. There's a way to do that more than there ever had. You're not on an island. There's somebody that can help you, if you have that passion. And, happy to talk more specifically offline and get into the specifics of it. But I do think there's more promise now, and I think, there are places that you can get published and do the work.
So he's like the hope
Yeah,
translator.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, you're about to get.
No, listen. I wasn't going to answer, but now I am. I agree. But here's the thing. I don't have to tell you you're going out into a very tough landscape. And the thing about, I never want to tell anyone, but particularly young people of color, to just, it's your passion, you should just do it even if you don't make money. Like, we don't have that luxury, right? Like, and I know that's not what you're saying. We don't have that luxury. Like I'm sure you need to be able to pay your bills. And so it is tough. What I will say though is, and especially starting out, we all have to find ways to do that thing we want to do. We do the thing that we have to, that pays our bills, and then we find, I was the one who would come into the newsroom at 8 a.m., which isn't even super early, but in a newsroom it's early, right? So everyone else is rolling in at 10. So from 8 to 10, I'm working on the thing that I want to work on. I'm making calls, I'm starting to dig, and you're just pulling that string. And then at 10 o'clock when my boss comes in, I transition to working on the things that she wants me to work on. And so I think if it's something that you really have a passion about, I do want you to be able to pay your bills. I do want you to be able to make a living. I don't want you to kill yourself for this. But for a while, you're gonna have to find ways to do that thing that you want to do until you get someone to support you financially to be able to do that thing. And what you will find in this industry is if you land something, right, we do have such a great respect for that person who's just willing to go out there and dig and figure out a way to make a way. Then somebody is going to help you make that way. But you might have some struggles to get there, but if you have a passion, and this is why I think our profession, again, none of us get into this to make a lot of money. We know we're not going to, we're driven by something. We feel like this is the thing, at least I do, that I was called on this earth to do. Then find that story and tell that story, and once you do that, someone's gonna help you make the path. But I won't say that it won't be a struggle at first, it probably will.
Thank you. So, I would like to say thank you to Nikole and Kevin. Please don't get up because Bernice is about to come out to make an announcement. Thank you.
Thank y'all.